What if the smallest act of kindness, kneeling to tie a child's broken shoelace, could reopen the door to the greatest love you ever lost? If this story touches your heart, please subscribe so you never miss the rest of this healing journey. The autumn air in New York City carried a kind of crispness that hinted at endings and beginnings all at once. Central Park, draped in amber and russet leaves, was alive with its usual symphony. Joggers' steady footfalls on the paths, children's laughter rising and fading like wind through branches, the faraway hum of cabs circling the perimeter. David Miller, in his tailored gray overcoat, walked briskly along the park's mall. His phone buzzed inside his pocket, another message from his board of directors. He ignored it. For once, he wasn't here to negotiate mergers or soothe investors. He had been restless all morning, inexplicably drawn to walk the paths of a park he rarely visited anymore. As he turned a corner near the Bethesda Terrace, he noticed a small group of children gathered in a loose circle. Their voices carried sharp edges, mocking tones that made his chest tighten instinctively. At the center of their jeers stood a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with skin the color of warm bronze and curls pulled into two uneven ponytails. Her sneakers, once white, were scuffed gray, the sole on the left one peeling away. "Look at her shoes!" one boy shouted, his laughter slicing through the air. "Maybe she found them in the trash," another added. The girl kept her chin lifted, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. She pressed her lips tight, determined not to cry in front of them, but her small hands fidgeted nervously at her sides, betraying her effort. David felt something shift inside him, something raw and unbidden. Before he could stop himself, he stepped forward, his polished leather shoes crunching over leaves. The children scattered a little, uncertain now that an adult had entered the scene. Kneeling down so that his tall frame folded neatly onto one knee, David looked at the girl. Her sneakers were indeed worn, the laces frayed, one untied and trailing dangerously. He didn't ask permission, didn't announce himself with the voice of a billionaire used to being recognized. Instead, he spoke softly, gently, like he remembered speaking to his little sister long ago in the Bronx before the world had hardened him. "Shoelaces have a way of coming undone at the worst times," he murmured. "Mind if I fix this one for you?" The girl blinked at him, startled. Her eyes were wide, guarded but curious. Slowly, she nodded. With practiced hands, David threaded the frayed lace through the eyelets, pulled it snug, and tied a double knot. He brushed a fallen leaf from the top of her sneaker as if completing some ancient ritual of care. The jeers had stopped. The other children, suddenly sheepish, backed away. One muttered something about going home, and soon the group dissolved into the distance. "There," David said, lifting his gaze to hers. "That should hold a little longer. But you know, it's not the shoes that matter. It's the steps you take in them." The girl studied him with an intensity that startled him. For a moment it was as if she were looking not at a stranger, but at someone faintly familiar. And then he heard it, her voice, small but steady. "Why would you help me?" David's throat tightened. How could he explain the sudden pull, the ache in his chest? He opened his mouth, but before words could form, another voice cut sharply through the air. "Lily!" He turned. There, striding across the path, was a woman carrying the hurried grace of someone who had endured more than her share of burdens. Her hair, once auburn, now carried hints of chestnut threaded with silver. She wore a simple coat, nothing expensive, but her presence was commanding. David froze. His pulse stumbled. Time, it seemed, had folded in on itself, because he knew that face, that voice. He knew it from years past, from nights spent dreaming of what might have been. "Rachel," he whispered. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching as her eyes locked on his. For an instant, Central Park seemed to fall silent. The carousel music in the distance dulled, the wind stilled, the world held its breath. Rachel's gaze flicked from David to the little girl, Lily, then back to David. Her eyes darkened, a storm gathering. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone sharp with disbelief. David rose slowly from his knee, towering but unsteady. She was... her shoelace." His words faltered, clumsy, inadequate. Rachel's jaw tightened. She reached for Lily's hand, protective and urgent. "Come on, sweetheart, we're leaving." But Lily resisted, just enough to surprise them both. "Mama," she said, her small voice breaking the tension. "He helped me. They were laughing, and he made them stop." Rachel glanced down at her daughter, then back at David. The anger in her eyes softened, but only slightly. "You don't get to step back into our lives just because you stumbled across us in a park." David swallowed hard. "I didn't plan this. I didn't even know." He stopped himself. The truth clawed at his throat, but he couldn't force it past the weight of all those years apart. Rachel turned, guiding Lily firmly away. "We're fine," she said over her shoulder, her voice flat, final. David stood rooted to the ground, the autumn wind tugging at his coat. He watched them disappear down the path, hand in hand, mother and daughter silhouetted against the golden leaves. Something inside him broke open then, raw and irreparable. Because in Lily's eyes, he had seen more than innocence. He had seen himself. That night, back in his penthouse overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, David couldn't escape the image of the little girl, the way she had lifted her chin against cruelty, the way she had looked at him almost as if she had known him. He poured a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. He scrolled through unread emails, market reports, and headlines. None of it mattered. For the first time in years, the empire he had built felt hollow. Her name lingered in his mind. Lily. And beneath that name, a question burned so fierce it refused to be silenced. Could she be mine? The morning after that fateful encounter in Central Park, David Miller sat at his dining table staring into a cup of untouched coffee. Manhattan stretched out below his penthouse windows, steel and glass shimmering in the weak November sun. Usually, the view filled him with pride, a reminder of the empire he had carved out from sheer ambition. Today, it felt more like a cage. He couldn't escape the image of Lily's wide, guarded eyes, the way she'd held herself, defiant despite the cruelty of other children. And Rachel, her voice cutting through the air like a blade sharpened on old wounds. He hadn't seen her in almost 7 years. He had imagined what he might say if that day ever came, but when it arrived, words had abandoned him. All he had managed was a shoelace, tied with trembling hands, while his heart recognized what his mind was too afraid to admit. By noon, David found himself behind the wheel of his black Range Rover, navigating uptown traffic. His assistant had tried to call twice about a pending deal in Singapore. He silenced the phone both times. Deals could wait. There was something far more important pulling him north, toward Harlem. Harlem's streets carried a rhythm different from Midtown's glass towers. Brownstones stood shoulder to shoulder, their facades weathered but dignified. Corner stores spilled aromas of fried chicken and fresh coffee. Murals bloomed across brick walls, telling stories of resilience, heritage, and pride. David parked discreetly a block away and walked the rest on foot. His cashmere coat marked him as out of place, but he hardly noticed. His eyes scanned door numbers until they landed on the building Rachel had entered with Lily the night before. A modest walk-up, its entryway painted a faded green. He hesitated on the stoop, memories flooding him. Nights in his 20s when he and Rachel had walked through Harlem after jazz shows, hands intertwined, dreaming of futures neither had imagined clearly. Futures that had diverged so violently he still carried the scars. He raised a hand to knock, but froze when laughter drifted down the stairwell. Lily's voice. High, musical, untamed. He leaned against the railing, listening without meaning to, his chest tightening with a longing he couldn't name. The door opened suddenly. Rachel stepped out, holding a grocery tote heavy with apples and bread. She stopped short, her eyes widening when she saw him. "David," she said flatly. He straightened, guilt blooming like heat in his chest. "Rachel, I didn't mean to intrude. I just—" Her lips pressed into a line. "You followed us." "Yes." He swallowed hard. "I had to. I needed to see you, to understand." Rachel's gaze flicked toward the stairwell. She stepped outside, shutting the door firmly behind her. "You don't belong here. This isn't your world anymore." David shook his head. "It doesn't matter where I live, Rachel. What matters is—" He hesitated, searching her eyes. "Why did you leave without telling me the truth?" Her jaw tightened. For a moment, he thought she might walk away. Instead, she let out a slow, weary breath. "Because your world," she said quietly, "wasn't a place I wanted my daughter to grow up in." The word struck him like a blow. Daughter. Rachel continued, her voice firm though her hands trembled around the tote. "I watched what money and power did to you, David. How it hollowed you out. How every headline about you was another negotiation, another conquest. I couldn't put a child into that arena. I wanted her to know laughter without cameras, mistakes without gossip columns. A home, not a penthouse." David's throat worked, but no sound emerged. Her words were a mirror, reflecting a man he barely recognized but couldn't deny. "You think I wouldn't have chosen differently?" he whispered finally. "You think I didn't want a family with you?" Rachel's eyes softened, just for a heartbeat. "I know you wanted it once, but somewhere along the way, ambition won. And I couldn't let it win over her too." She adjusted the tote on her shoulder and moved to step past him. "Rachel, wait." His voice cracked, raw. "Is she mine?" Rachel froze. She didn't turn around. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant wail of a siren and the rhythmic thrum of a city that never slept. Finally, she spoke. "A father isn't just blood, David. A father is presence. And you weren't there." The words cut deeper than any accusation. He felt himself sway, steadying on the railing as she descended the stoop. She didn't look back. Inside the apartment, Lily sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, coloring in a school workbook. She glanced up when her mother returned, sensing the heaviness in her shoulders. "Mama?" Rachel forced a smile, setting down the groceries. "Just someone from the past, sweetheart. Nothing you need to worry about." But Lily tilted her head, her 6-year-old intuition sharper than Rachel liked to admit. "Is he the man who tied my shoe?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Lily bit her lip thoughtfully. "He looked at me funny." Rachel knelt beside her, smoothing a hand over her curls. "Not funny, baby. Just surprised." "Why?" Rachel's throat tightened. "Because sometimes grown-ups see something that reminds them of what they lost." Lily's brow furrowed. "Did he lose us?" Rachel pulled her into a fierce embrace, blinking back tears. "No, Lily. We're not something anyone loses. We're right here. Together." Yet deep down, she feared the question was only beginning. Back at his penthouse, David stood before a mirror, untying the silk tie he hadn't noticed tightening around his neck. He saw the reflection of a man the world admired. Forbes covers, Wall Street darling, empire builder. But beneath the surface, another man stirred, the boy abandoned by his own father in the Bronx, the lover who had once whispered promises into Rachel's hair, the stranger who had tied a shoelace for a child and felt his soul tremble. Her words echoed mercilessly. A father is presence. David poured himself into his leather chair and opened his laptop. His fingers hovered, then began typing an address into a search bar. Gene Point Laboratory, New Jersey. If Rachel would not give him the truth, he would seek it himself. The Hudson River glistened in the pale light of dawn as David Miller's car rolled across the George Washington Bridge. The Range Rover's engine purred, but inside, silence pressed against him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. For a man whose empire stretched across continents, whose decisions shaped markets, the journey to a modest laboratory in New Jersey felt like the heaviest negotiation of his life. The GPS directed him through narrow streets until he arrived at Genopoint Diagnostics, a discreet, two-story building that blended into its surroundings. There were no marble lobbies or gilt logos here, just brick walls, a blue awning, and a sign that promised accuracy more than prestige. David stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, sharp and sterile. Behind the reception desk sat a middle-aged woman in scrubs, glasses perched low on her nose. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I need a paternity test," David said. His voice was calm, but his pulse hammered in his throat. The woman nodded with professional detachment. "We'll need a sample from you and the child." David hesitated. He hadn't thought this through. Rachel would never agree. He cleared his throat. "Could you test me against a personal item? Something the child has used?" The woman studied him for a moment. She'd seen desperation before. "If you have a hairbrush, toothbrush, or something similar, yes. It won't be court admissible without chain of custody, but for personal knowledge, it works." David reached into his coat pocket. Wrapped in a handkerchief was a pencil Lily had dropped the day before in Central Park, its eraser chewed at the edges. He set it gently on the counter, as if it were made of glass. The woman lifted it carefully. "This will do. Results in 3 business days. Would you like them emailed or picked up in person?" "In person," David said quickly. He didn't want the truth delivered to an inbox like another quarterly report. He wanted to feel it, to face it. The days crawled. David immersed himself in meetings, but his concentration fractured. During a pitch with investors from Dubai, he found himself scribbling Lily's name absent-mindedly in the margin of his notebook. At night, he wandered his penthouse restlessly, replaying memories of Rachel, the way she once believed in him before the world claimed him. He saw his own childhood reflected in flashes, a boy abandoned in the Bronx, clutching a broken baseball glove, waiting for a father who never returned. The ache of that absence had propelled him upward, each success a shield against the void. But now, staring into the possibility that he had unknowingly repeated history, his empire felt like a hollow fortress. 3 days later, he returned to Genopoint. The receptionist handed him a sealed envelope, her expression neutral. David walked back to his car and sat behind the wheel, staring at it. His hands shook as he broke the seal. Inside, the letter was clinical, devoid of sentiment. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. The words blurred as his vision burned. He pressed the paper to his chest, exhaling a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. "She is mine." Relief surged through him, but it was tangled with grief. For the 6 years lost, for the first steps he hadn't seen, for birthdays celebrated without him, for lullabies he had never sung. David leaned back against the leather seat, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt stripped bare. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but simply a man holding the truth of fatherhood in trembling hands. That evening, he drove back to Harlem. The streets buzzed with life. Children playing double dutch on sidewalks, elders chatting outside corner shops, gospel music drifting from a church. He parked near Rachel's building and climbed the stoop, the envelope tucked in his coat. Rachel opened the door, her expression wary. "David, what are you doing here?" He held up the envelope like a fragile offering. "I know." Her eyes narrowed. "Know what?" "That Lily is mine." His voice cracked. "I had to be sure." Rachel's face flushed with anger. "You had no right. That was her life, our life. You can't just buy the truth with a lab test." David stepped closer, desperation spilling from him. "Rachel, please. I lost years because I didn't know, because you didn't tell me." Her voice was sharp, trembling with restraint. "And if I had? You would have brought paparazzi to her first birthday? Security guards to her kindergarten classroom? She would have grown up in a cage of privilege, never knowing who she was outside your shadow." "She's already in my shadow," David said softly. "The world will find her one way or another, but she deserves to know me not as a headline, but as her father." From inside, Lily's voice floated out. "Mama, who's at the door?" Rachel's shoulders stiffened. She turned her head slightly. "Just someone leaving, baby." But Lily appeared anyway, peeking around her mother's hip. Her eyes lit when she saw David, though she tried to mask it with curiosity. "It's the man who tied my shoe," she said matter-of-factly. David's heart twisted. He crouched slightly, lowering his gaze to her level. "Hello, Lily." His voice trembled. Rachel cut in sharply. "Enough, David." She stepped forward, her hand protective on Lily's shoulder. But Lily tilted her head, watching him with that same intensity as in the park. "Mama, why are you mad? He didn't do anything bad." Rachel's lips pressed together, her eyes darting between them. For a moment, the weight of truth hung heavy in the narrow hallway, binding them in a silence more powerful than words. Finally, Rachel exhaled, her voice soft. "Go inside, sweetheart." Lily obeyed reluctantly, glancing back at David before disappearing down the hall. Rachel turned back to him, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "You may have proof on paper, David, but fatherhood isn't ink and probability. It's showing up, every day." He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Then let me show up. Let me try." Her gaze lingered, torn between old wounds and the faintest flicker of hope. She closed the door gently, leaving him alone on the stoop, the envelope clutched in his hand like both a key and a burden. Back in his car, David stared at the Harlem skyline glowing against the night. The lab result burned in his pocket, undeniable. Yet Rachel's words echoed louder. A father is presence. For the first time in his life, David understood that the greatest challenge ahead wasn't a hostile takeover or a billion-dollar deal. It was the daily, unglamorous, sacred work of being a father, and he wasn't sure if Rachel would ever let him prove it. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not walk away. Not again. The first snow of the season had dusted Manhattan that morning, frosting the sidewalks in a thin, glittering veil. Central Park had turned into a winter postcard, children chasing each other with mittened hands, horse-drawn carriages clipping past, and families sipping hot chocolate near Woolman Rink. David Miller stood by the gates of the Central Park Zoo, his breath visible in the cold air. In his hands, he held a brown paper bag, not catered lunches or chef-prepared delicacies, but simple sandwiches he had made himself in the early hours, clumsy but earnest. He couldn't remember the last time he had used his own kitchen. This was no boardroom negotiation, no empire to impress. It was an invitation, a risk. Rachel had agreed reluctantly after a long silence over the phone 2 nights ago. "One lunch," she had said firmly, and only because Lily asked. David knew the terms were fragile, but even a single hour with them was a door cracked open, and he was determined not to slam it shut. When they arrived, David's heart nearly faltered. Lily came bouncing down the zoo path in her red wool coat, curls escaping from under her knitted hat, her mittens dangling from strings sewn into her sleeves. She spotted him instantly and waved with both arms. "Mr. Shoelace," she called out. David laughed, startled by the nickname, but the sound warmed him. Rachel followed behind, her stride cautious but steady. She wore a navy scarf wrapped tightly around her, her auburn hair catching the winter sun. Her eyes met his, guarded but not as sharp as before. "Hi, David," Lily said when she reached him, her voice bright. "Mama said you wanted to eat lunch with us. Did you really make sandwiches yourself?" "I did," David admitted, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. "But you'll have to be the judge of whether they're any good." Lily grinned. "I'm a very tough judge." Rachel shook her head, amused despite herself. "You've been warned." They found a picnic table near the zoo's sea lion pool. Children pressed against the glass nearby, squealing as the sleek animals darted through the water. David laid out the sandwiches, some cut diagonally like he remembered his sister once preferred, others uneven because his hands had trembled while making them. He also brought thermoses of hot cocoa, turkey and cheese, peanut butter and jelly, and one grilled veggie, he announced, almost nervously. "I didn't know what you'd like." Lily reached for the PB&J, biting into it without hesitation. She chewed thoughtfully, then gave a solemn nod. "Not bad." Relief swept through David so strongly he laughed out loud. Rachel hid a smile behind her thermos. They ate in relative quiet at first, the sounds of the zoo filling the silence. Finally, Lily broke it. "Kids at school say mean things sometimes," she said matter-of-factly, swinging her legs under the bench. "They laugh because Mama can't buy me shoes like theirs. Yesterday, one of them said my skin was too dark and I don't belong." Rachel stiffened. "Lily." But the little girl pressed on. "I told them I belong with Mama. But then they asked who my dad is, and I didn't know what to say." Her words cut into David like glass. He swallowed hard. Rachel's gaze flicked to him, her eyes clouded. "Lily, you don't have to answer kids like that. They don't decide your worth." "But I want to know," Lily said softly. She looked at David, her eyes wide, searching. "If you're my dad, why weren't you there when I was born?" The air stilled. Even the sea lions seemed quieter, their splashes muted under the weight of the question. David inhaled slowly, his breath shaking. He glanced at Rachel, who said nothing, her lips pressed tight. This was his moment. He turned back to Lily. "The truth is, I didn't know about you. And that's my fault because I wasn't there for your mama when she needed me most. I chose work. I chose the wrong things. And because of that, I missed the most important moment of my life, meeting you." Lily studied him with a seriousness far beyond her years. "So you weren't there because of money?" "Yes," David admitted. His voice cracked. "And I regret it every single day." She tilted her head. "Are you still choosing money now?" The question pierced him deeper than any investor's challenge ever had. Slowly, he shook his head. "No, Lily. I want to choose you." For a long moment, the little girl said nothing. Then she reached across the table, placing her mittened hand over his. Her palm was small, but the weight of it nearly undid him. Rachel looked away quickly, her lashes damp. After lunch, they wandered through the zoo together. Lily pressed her face to the glass at the penguin house, squealing with delight as they waddled like clumsy dancers. David found himself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time in years. Rachel watched quietly, her guard softening as she saw the ease between them. Near the snow leopard enclosure, Lily slipped her hand into David's without asking. He froze, then squeezed gently. Rachel's voice broke the moment, low and cautious. David, this doesn't change everything. You can't just walk back in and expect to erase the past. I don't want to erase it, he said quietly, his breath fogging in the cold air. I want to build something new. For her. For us. Rachel's eyes flickered with pain and longing all at once. She looked at Lily, whose mittened hand swung easily in David's. Prove it, she whispered. David nodded, his jaw firm. I will. That night, back in Harlem, Rachel tucked Lily into bed. The little girl snuggled under her quilt, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Mama? She murmured. Yes, baby? Do you think he'll come back again? Rachel brushed a curl from her daughter's forehead. Do you want him to? Lily hesitated, then whispered, Yes. Rachel's throat tightened. She kissed her daughter's cheek and turned off the light. In the darkness, she allowed herself to hope for the first time in years, but only for Lily's sake. Meanwhile, in his penthouse, David stood at his window overlooking the glittering city. For once, the view didn't make him feel powerful. It made him feel responsible. The paper bag from lunch still sat on his counter, crumpled but precious. He whispered into the silence, as if to a child already asleep miles away. I'll show up, I promise. And for the first time in his life, David Miller felt the weight of a vow heavier than any contract he had ever signed. The week after their lunch at Central Park Zoo, a fragile rhythm began to take shape. David texted Rachel each morning asking if Lily needed anything for school. Pencils, boots, a winter coat. Rachel refused most of it, her pride like a shield, but sometimes she relented when it came to essentials. David accepted her boundaries with surprising patience, each small yes feeling like a step forward. But life has a way of testing promises. It was a Wednesday morning when Rachel's phone rang while she was folding laundry. On the other end was the principal of PS 129, the Manhattan elementary school Lily attended. His voice carried the strained politeness of someone bracing for conflict. Ms. Johnson, he began, there was an incident with Lily today. Some students left her a note in her cubby. We've spoken to them, and we assure you it was just teasing, nothing serious. Rachel's stomach dropped. What kind of note? Perhaps it's better if you come in to discuss it. But Rachel was already grabbing her coat. She called David without thinking. Meet me at the school. Now! When David arrived, his sleek black car looked jarringly out of place against the faded brick facade of the school. He strode inside, his long coat trailing behind him, his face set in grim determination. Rachel was waiting in the lobby, her arms crossed tightly. She handed him a folded piece of paper. The words scrawled in childish handwriting were cruel. Your skin is dirt. Your daddy is rich, but he doesn't want you. Nobody does. David's chest burned as he read it. Rage, sharp and unfiltered, surged in him. He clenched the paper so tightly it crumpled in his fist. Rachel's eyes were weary. The principal said it was just kids being kids. Kids being kids! David's voice thundered down the hallway, startling a passing teacher. This isn't teasing. This is racism. This is cruelty. Rachel put a hand on his arm, trying to steady him. David, please, don't make a scene. But David shook his head. No, silence is what lets it grow. In the principal's office, the atmosphere was thick with unease. The principal, a balding man in a beige sweater vest, attempted a soothing smile. "Mr. Miller, Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming. We've addressed the matter with the students involved. They've been reminded about kindness." David leaned forward, his voice like steel. Kindness. This isn't about forgetting to share crayons. This is targeted hate against a 6-year-old girl, against my daughter. The word slipped out. Daughter. And Rachel flinched, but she said nothing. The principal adjusted his glasses nervously. "We try not to label things too harshly at this age. Children don't always understand the weight of their words." "They understood enough to write it down," David snapped. He pulled the note from his pocket, flattening it on the desk. "Read it again. That is not innocent. That is not a mistake. That is racism. Call it what it is." The principal's face reddened. "Mr. Miller, I assure you—" "No," David cut in. His voice softened, but carried more force than shouting. "You assure me of nothing until you stand in front of your staff and call this by its true name. You're not protecting children by minimizing it. You're protecting yourself." Rachel watched, torn between fear that he would burn every bridge and awe at his conviction. The principal shifted uncomfortably. We'll review our anti-bullying curriculum." "Do more than review it," David said firmly. "I will personally fund an initiative for diversity training and inclusive education in this school if that's what it takes. But don't you dare dismiss my daughter's pain." The office fell silent. Even Rachel had no words. Later that afternoon, Lily sat in her classroom, her curls falling over her workbook. She hadn't cried when she found the note. She had folded it, put it in her backpack, and walked quietly to class. But now, as the teacher explained math problems, her pencil trembled in her hand. At dismissal, David was waiting by the school gates. The other children stared, whispering about the tall man in the expensive coat. Lily spotted him and ran, her small boots crunching against the pavement. "Mr. Shoelace!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his waist. He crouched, hugging her tightly. "Lily," he whispered, his throat thick. "I saw the note." She looked up, her eyes uncertain. "Did I do something wrong?" "No." His voice broke. "No, sweetheart. You did everything right. What they wrote was wrong. And I'm going to make sure it never happens again." Rachel watched from a few steps away, her eyes glassy. That evening, they gathered in Rachel's small kitchen in Harlem. The apartment smelled faintly of simmering stew. Lily sat at the table, coloring quietly, while David and Rachel stood near the counter. "She's stronger than I realized," David said softly. "Stronger than I was at her age." Rachel stirred the pot, her hands unsteady. "She had to be. The world doesn't go easy on girls like her." David studied her profile, illuminated by the soft kitchen light. "And yet you carried it alone. You shouldn't have had to." Rachel turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "I chose to, because I couldn't trust you to choose us back then." He nodded slowly, accepting the weight of her truth. "Then let me choose now. Let me fight for her with you." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she stopped. The silence stretched between them, filled only by Lily's humming as she colored. Finally, Rachel whispered, "We'll see." That night, David returned to his penthouse, but the view of Manhattan felt different. It no longer gleamed like a kingdom. It glared like a challenge. On his desk lay the crumpled note, smoothed out again. He stared at the words until they blurred. Then he picked up a pen and began drafting a plan. Meetings with education advocates, lawyers, community leaders. If his wealth had once been a weapon of conquest, he would wield it now as a shield. For Lily. The family court building on Lafayette Street in Lower Manhattan looked nothing like the skyscrapers David Miller usually strode into. It was plain, utilitarian, its gray stone walls weathered by years of sorrowful stories. Yet as David stepped through its doors that morning, dressed not in his usual armor of a power suit but in a simple navy blazer, he felt more fear than he had ever felt negotiating billion-dollar mergers. Rachel walked beside him, her coat buttoned to the throat, her face pale but composed. Lily trotted between them, holding her stuffed rabbit tucked safely in her backpack. She didn't fully understand what court meant, only that today was about her name. And names, she sensed, mattered. David had filed a petition to have his name added to Lily's birth certificate. It wasn't about ownership. It was about belonging, about recognition, about making visible the truth already carved into his heart. Inside the courtroom, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The wooden benches creaked as families waited for their turn before the judge. When their case was called, David, Rachel, and Lily approached the front. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a bun, peered down from the bench. Her nameplate read, Honorable Margaret Levine. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Mr. Miller, Ms. Johnson," she began. "I have before me a petition regarding the birth certificate of a minor child, Lily Johnson. Mr. Miller requests to have his surname legally recognized. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," David replied, his voice steady though his palms sweated. Judge Levine looked to Rachel. "And Ms. Johnson, what is your position?" Rachel drew in a breath. "Your Honor, I don't dispute paternity. The test confirmed it. My concern is stability. Lily has only ever known my last name. She is 6 years old. This isn't just paperwork, it's her identity." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Understood. The child's sense of identity is paramount." She looked at Lily, who sat swinging her legs nervously on the wooden bench. "Lily, sweetheart, do you know why you're here?" Lily glanced at her mother, then at David. Her voice was small but clear. "It's about my name." "That's right," Judge Levine said gently. "And what do you think about that?" The courtroom hushed. Even the clerk paused his typing. Lily fidgeted with the hem of her dress, then lifted her chin, her curls bouncing. "I want my name to be like my heart." The judge leaned forward slightly. "And what does your heart say?" Lily looked straight at David. Her eyes were steady, unblinking. "It says he's my dad." Gasps rippled softly across the benches. David's throat constricted, his vision blurred. Rachel pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears brimming. Judge Levine regarded the little girl for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. "Thank you, Lily. That was very brave." The rest of the hearing moved through legalities, verifying documents, ensuring due process, but the moment had already been decided in everyone's hearts. When Judge Levine delivered her ruling, her voice carried quiet gravitas. "It is hereby ordered that the child's legal name shall be amended to include her father, Mr. David Miller. Henceforth, she shall be known as Lily Johnson Miller." David exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Relief and awe washed over him. But more than that, he felt a sacred weight. The responsibility of a name bound not by ink, but by presence. Rachel wiped her eyes discreetly. She didn't smile, not yet, but the hardness in her expression had softened into something closer to acceptance. Outside the courthouse, snowflakes fluttered gently against the pavement. Lily skipped between her parents, clutching both their hands. She grinned up at David. "Johnson Miller is long. Will it fit on my homework paper?" David laughed through the lump in his throat. "We'll make it fit. And if your teacher complains, you tell them your dad will buy bigger paper. Lily giggled. Rachel rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched into the faintest smile. For the first time, the three of them walked together not as fragments of a broken past, but as something new. Not whole yet, not healed yet, but bound by a name that belonged to them all. That night, David stood in his penthouse, gazing at the city lights. He pulled out a framed photo he had tucked away years ago, a picture of him and Rachel in their 20s, laughing on a pier in Brooklyn, carefree. He set it beside the folded court order, the official seal gleaming under the lamp. For years, his last name had symbolized power, empire, headlines. Tonight, it symbolized something far greater. Legacy, yes, but one made of presence, not possessions. And for the first time, David Miller whispered his daughter's full name aloud, letting it settle in the room like a benediction. Lily Johnson Miller. Snow lingered on the curbs of Manhattan, piled into dirty banks where taxis splashed gray water. David Miller's life, however, felt like it had been washed clean. The court order from Judge Levine was still fresh, tucked neatly into his leather briefcase, but in his heart, it was engraved permanently. Lily Johnson Miller. The name echoed in him like a vow. She was his daughter now, not only by blood, but by law. And yet, beneath the triumph, an unease stirred, an old wound he rarely let himself touch. It was late evening when the unease became flesh. David had taken Lily and Rachel to dinner at a small Harlem diner. They sat in a booth near the window, Lily happily drawing snowmen on her napkin while Rachel sipped coffee. For once, it felt almost ordinary, like a family. That's when a shadow fell across their table. David looked up. The man standing there was older than David remembered, but the resemblance was undeniable. The same tall frame, though bent now with age. The same piercing eyes, though dulled by years of regret. His coat was frayed, his hands rough. "David," the man said softly, voice gravelly with time. Rachel froze, recognizing the storm in David's face. Lily glanced up curiously. David's jaw tightened. "Thomas." The diner noise dulled, the clatter of plates and hum of conversation receding. For a moment, only the pounding of David's heart filled the silence. His father. The man who had walked out of his life when he was 12, leaving nothing but an empty baseball mitt and a trail of broken promises. Rachel recovered first. "Lily, sweetheart, why don't you show me your drawing by the counter?" Lily blinked, sensing the tension, but obeyed. She skipped toward the counter with Rachel, leaving David and Thomas face to face. Thomas's eyes flicked to the little girl, then back to his son. "She looks like you." David's chest burned. "You don't get to say that." Thomas flinched. "I know. I have no right. But when I saw her name in the paper, Johnson Miller, I knew it had to be you. I had to see you." David laughed bitterly. "Now you want to see me? After 3 decades?" "I was a coward," Thomas admitted, his voice trembling. "I ran because I didn't know how to stay. Your mother deserved better. You deserved better." David's fists clenched under the table. Memories rose like ghosts, waiting at the window for a father who never came home, watching his mother cry over unpaid bills, promising himself he'd never need anyone again. "You think words fix that?" David's voice was low, dangerous. "You think showing up in a diner after 30 years makes you a father again?" "No," Thomas whispered. "But maybe it's not too late to be a grandfather." The words cut deeper than David expected. He thought of Lily, her wide eyes and fearless questions. The thought of this man, this deserter, touching her life filled him with fury. "You left me," David spat. "You don't get to leave her too. Stay away." Thomas's shoulders sagged. "I deserve that. But David, you don't want to carry this anger forever. It poisons everything. Believe me, I know." David stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "You don't get to preach. You forfeited that right the day you walked out of the Bronx and never came back." Rachel returned with Lily, her eyes sharp on Thomas. "We're leaving." David nodded, guiding Lily's small hand into his. She looked up, confused. "Who was that man?" "No one," David said quickly, too quickly. But Rachel's gaze lingered on him, knowing the truth would not stay buried. That night, David lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling. Lily had fallen asleep curled against Rachel on the couch after they returned, exhausted by the long day. David had carried her to bed, tucked the quilt around her, kissed her forehead. But the image of Thomas lingered, unshakable. He saw himself at 12 years old again, clutching that baseball mitt, waiting at the window. He remembered the way his mother's hands trembled as she tried to reassure him. He remembered vowing he'd never forgive. And yet Lily's voice echoed in his mind. "If you're my dad, why weren't you there?" The irony was cruel. He had sworn not to be like Thomas, and yet for 6 years he too had been absent from his child's life. Not by choice, but absence all the same. For the first time in years, David wept. Not the angry, private tears of frustration, but deep, shaking sobs of a boy who had carried abandonment too long. The following weekend, Lily came home from school with an assignment, the family tree project. She spread the large sheet of paper across Rachel's kitchen table, drawing branches with green crayons. "This is me," she said, sketching a stick figure with curly hair. "And Mama." She drew Rachel beside her. Then, carefully, she added David, tall, with a tie. "Who else should I put?" she asked innocently. Rachel hesitated. "You can put whoever you want, baby." Lily bit her lip, then drew an older man with gray hair. "I saw him at the diner. The man who looked like you, David. Was he your dad?" The room stilled. David's chest tightened. He wanted to say no, to erase Thomas as if he'd never existed. But Lily's eyes, curious, trusting, held him. "Yes," David admitted softly. "That was my father." "Then he's part of my tree too," Lily said simply, adding Thomas's figure. David swallowed hard, watching his daughter do with crayons what he could not yet do with his heart, make space for a man who had abandoned him. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Rachel found David standing at the window again. "She has a way of pulling truth out of you," Rachel said gently. David nodded, his voice rough. "I don't want him near her, but I can't stop her from wanting to know where she comes from." Rachel touched his arm lightly. "Maybe this isn't just about Lily. Maybe it's about you too. Maybe facing him is the only way you'll stop carrying him like a shadow." David closed his eyes, the city lights blurring. He didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but for Lily's sake, for the sake of not repeating history, he knew he would have to try. The first Monday of December dawned gray and cold over Manhattan, the kind of day when the city seemed to hunch its shoulders against the wind. Inside Rachel's small Harlem apartment, however, the kitchen table glowed with life. Sheets of poster board, scattered crayons, colored pencils, and glue sticks transformed the modest room into a workshop of creation. Lily sat at the center, her tongue poking out in concentration as she sketched the trunk of a sprawling oak tree. Its branches stretched wide across the page, each one waiting for names, faces, and memories. "It's for school," Lily explained earnestly when David leaned over her shoulder. Everyone has to make a family tree. Ms. Gomez says it shows where we come from. David smiled faintly, though his chest tightened. Where he came from was a story of abandonment and ambition. Where Lily came from was more complicated, a tangle of love, loss, and second chances. Rachel set down a mug of cocoa for her daughter, then stood back, watching as Lily scribbled in names. "This is me?" Lily said, sketching her stick figure with curly hair and a bright red dress. "And this is Mama." She drew Rachel with straight auburn hair and a blue scarf. Next came David, tall and in a tie, smiling in Lily's childlike style. She labeled him carefully, "Dad, the man who tied my shoe." David's throat constricted. He blinked quickly, hiding his tears with a sip of coffee. The crayons moved again. Lily added her great-grandmother Annabelle, whom she'd met only a handful of times but remembered for the butterscotch candies always in her purse. Then, without hesitation, Lily sketched another figure, a gray-haired man beside David. Rachel's breath caught. David stiffened. "Who's that, sweetheart?" Rachel asked softly. "That's the man from the diner," Lily said simply. "The one who looked like Daddy. He's Grandpa. Right?" The room went very still. David's hands tightened around his mug. He wanted to deny it, to erase the man from the branches of their lives. But Lily's eyes, wide, trusting, held him. "Yes," David said finally, his voice low. "That's my father. His name is Thomas." Lily wrote it carefully in block letters. Grandpa Thomas. David swallowed hard. To see the name there, inked by a child's innocent hand, was almost unbearable. The project continued. Lily drew cousins she barely knew, aunts she had met only once. Each figure received a smile, a label, a place. For her, there were no fractures, no betrayals, only branches on the same tree. When she finished, she leaned back proudly. The poster board was crowded with figures, messy and colorful, but alive. David studied it, his chest aching. At the top, in bold letters, Lily had written, "My family, the people who stay." He pointed to his own drawing. "Why did you write that about me?" Lily looked at him as though the answer were obvious. "Because you stayed when the kids at school were mean. You stayed when Mama didn't want you around. You tied my shoe and you didn't leave." David's composure cracked. He turned away, pressing a hand to his eyes. Rachel watched quietly, her heart torn open by the sight. A week later, Lily carried her project into her classroom at PS 129. The room buzzed with children presenting trees filled with perfect nuclear families, 2 parents, grandparents, tidy symmetry. When it was her turn, Lily marched to the front with her poster. She pointed proudly to each branch. "This is my mama," she said. "She works the hardest of anyone I know. And this is my dad, the man who tied my shoe when other kids laughed at me. He's my hero." David, standing in the back near the doorway, froze. Parents had been invited to watch, and though Rachel had hesitated, Lily insisted both come. Lily continued. "This is my Grandma Annabelle. She gives me candy. And this is Grandpa Thomas. I don't really know him yet, but my dad says he's part of my tree, so I put him in too." The teacher blinked, visibly moved. Other parents shifted in their seats, some dabbing their eyes. "And that's everyone," Lily finished with a grin. "My family isn't perfect, but it's mine. And the people on this tree are the people who stay, even when it's hard." The room erupted in applause. David's chest swelled with both pride and humility. Rachel brushed a tear from her cheek. That night, back at the apartment, Lily taped her project to the wall above her bed. She gazed at it with satisfaction before falling asleep, her breathing soft and even. Rachel and David sat in the kitchen, the glow of a single lamp between them. "She sees the best in everyone," Rachel murmured. David nodded. Even in Thomas. Rachel studied him. And what about you? Do you see the best in him? David looked down, his jaw tightening. All I see is the boy he left behind. But Lily's right. He's part of her. I can't change that. Rachel reached across the table, her hand brushing his. Maybe it's not about changing it. Maybe it's about choosing how the story goes from here. David's eyes met hers. For a moment, the years of hurt seemed to lift, leaving only the possibility of something new. Later, alone in his penthouse, David pulled out a blank sheet of paper. He began to sketch his own tree, something he hadn't done since boyhood. At first, he drew it the way he remembered, just his mother and himself, a trunk without branches. But slowly, he added Rachel, Lily, even Thomas. For the first time in his life, he let the tree grow. The auditorium at Harlem Charter School buzzed with anticipation. Folding chairs scraped across the polished gymnasium floor, parents whispered in the aisles, and children in colorful outfits fidgeted nervously on stage. It was Heritage Week, the annual celebration where students presented their roots, their heroes, and their dreams. Rachel sat in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, David adjusted his blazer, his composure uncharacteristically fragile. Lily had begged both of them to come, insisting she needed her whole family there. When Lily's name was called, she bounded onto the stage in her red dress, curls bouncing, cheeks glowing under the stage lights. She carried her family tree poster rolled under one arm. The teacher handed her the microphone. It looked comically large in her small hands, but she held it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted to say. "Hi," she began, her voice carrying clearly. "My name is Lily Johnson Miller. I want to tell you about my hero." Parents leaned forward, expecting her to name a famous activist, a historical figure, or perhaps her teacher. But Lily's eyes sought out David in the crowd, and when she found him, her voice grew steady. "My hero is my dad. Not because he's rich, not because of what people write about him in the news. My hero is my dad because he chose to stay." The audience stilled. Even the restless toddlers quieted, as if the room itself leaned in. Lily unrolled her family tree poster and held it up proudly. "See? My family isn't perfect. Some people left. Some people hurt each other. But my dad, he came back. He tied my shoe when other kids laughed at me. He stood up for me at school when someone was mean. He went to court so my name could be the same as my heart." David's vision blurred. Rachel pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shimmering. Lily continued, her small voice resonant with truth. "A hero isn't someone who saves the whole world. A hero is someone who chooses to stay in your world every day." Gasps and murmurs swept the auditorium. Phones lifted discreetly. Parents recorded. By the time Lily finished, her words were already on their way to being shared far beyond the walls of Harlem Charter School. The applause erupted like thunder, echoing off the gymnasium walls. Some parents wiped tears, others stood to their feet in ovation. David bowed his head, overwhelmed. For all his years commanding boardrooms, he had never felt as humbled as he did sitting in that folding chair, watching his daughter crown him with a title no business could bestow. Hero. That night, videos of Lily's speech flooded social media. By morning, hashtags trended across Twitter and Instagram. The little girl who taught a billionaire to stay /Lily Johnson. Miller, heroes, stay news outlets picked up the story. 6-year-old's speech redefines heroism, one headline read. Another declared, Billionaire's daughter reminds world what matters. David's office phone rang incessantly. Investors wanted comments. PR teams urged him to seize the moment. But David silenced the calls. This wasn't a campaign. It was a child's truth, raw and unpolished, and he refused to commercialize it. Rachel, too, felt the tidal wave. Neighbors stopped her on the street, congratulating her on raising such a brave daughter. Teachers sent notes of admiration. Yet beneath the pride, she felt fear that Lily's innocence would be swallowed by the world's hunger for spectacle. That evening, David arrived at Rachel's apartment with Chinese takeout. The aroma of sesame chicken and fried rice filled the small kitchen. Lily chattered excitedly about her classmates' reactions while munching on egg rolls. "Mr. Shoelace," she said between bites, "I think people liked my speech." David chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I think they loved it, Lily." Rachel gave him a sharp look. "Loved it too much, maybe. Do you realize she's all over the internet right now?" David's smile faded. "I didn't post it." "I know you didn't, but others did. And now her words, her face, her name are everywhere." Rachel's voice shook with frustration. "This is what I was afraid of, David. The spotlight, the intrusion." He set down his chopsticks, his expression sober. "You're right. But Rachel, she isn't just in the spotlight. She lit it herself. She stood on that stage and claimed her truth. That's not something we can hide." Rachel exhaled, torn. "She's 6 years old." "And already teaching me more than I've learned in 38 years, David said softly. Later, after Lily had gone to bed, Rachel and David sat by the kitchen window, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. "She sees you as her hero," Rachel murmured, "but she doesn't know all of you. The man who chased power, who let ambition swallow him whole." David's gaze was steady. "Then I'll show her all of me. The broken parts, the mistakes, the regrets. Because being her father isn't about hiding my past. It's about being present in her future." Rachel studied him, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "For her sake, I hope you mean that." "I do," David said, his voice firm. "For her, I'd burn every headline, every deal, every dollar. None of it matters if I'm not the man she believes I am." The next morning, as David walked down Fifth Avenue toward his office, a stranger stopped him. She was an elderly woman, her coat patched, her hands trembling as she clutched a cane. "You're the man from the news," she said. David braced himself, but the woman smiled faintly. "Your daughter's words. They healed something in me. My father left when I was little. I thought it meant I wasn't worth staying for. But she reminded me it wasn't about me. Thank you for letting her speak." David's throat tightened. He nodded silently, humbled. For the first time in his life, he realized his legacy wasn't in stock tickers or corporate towers. It was in the echoes of a little girl's voice reminding the world of a truth too easily forgotten. Heroes stay. Thanksgiving arrived with its quiet magic. The kind that settles over Manhattan like a hush before music. Skyscrapers glittered against a pale sky, their windows reflecting the early winter sun. On the Upper East Side, David Miller's penthouse glowed with warmth, not from chandeliers or Art Deco lamps, but from laughter. The dining table stretched longer than it had in years. At one end sat Rachel, carving roasted turkey with practiced hands. At the other sat David, pouring cider into Lily's cup. Between them, the table was crowded with dishes: stuffing, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, cranberry sauce glistening like jewels. And at the far side, leaning a little uncertainly in his chair, sat Thomas. The room held its breath when he had first walked through the penthouse door that afternoon. Rachel's eyes had narrowed, David's jaw had tightened, but Lily had skipped to greet him, her small hand tugging his. "You can sit next to me, Grandpa." And so he had. Dinner unfolded with an unexpected ease. Lily chattered about school, about penguins at the zoo, about how she wanted to be a shoelace doctor when she grew up. Someone who fixes little things so people don't trip. Her words made everyone laugh, the kind of laughter that loosens knots tied tight in the chest. Thomas spoke sparingly, but when he did, his voice was gentle. He asked Rachel about her work, complimented the meal, and listened intently to Lily's endless stories. David watched, torn. Every instinct in him screamed to guard his daughter, to protect her from the same abandonment he had known. Yet when Lily leaned her head against Thomas's arm, her face serene, David felt something crack. Not anger, but release. After dinner, they moved to the terrace. The city stretched below like a sea of lights, the Hudson shimmering in the distance. The air was crisp, but Lily insisted on bringing her sketchbook. She spread it across the outdoor table and began to draw with determination. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" Rachel asked, sipping tea from a steaming mug. "A bridge," Lily said, her crayon sweeping across the page. "A bridge that goes up, 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 all the way to the stars." David leaned closer, intrigued. "Why a bridge to the stars?" Lily shrugged as though it were obvious. "Because stars are where people go when they leave. But if you have a bridge, no one has to be gone forever. You can still walk to them, and they can walk back." Silence fell. Rachel's hand trembled around her mug. Thomas stared at his weathered hands, his throat working. David swallowed hard, his chest aching. "And who's on your bridge, Lily?" She grinned, pointing to the little stick figures she'd drawn climbing upward together. "Me, Mama, Dad, Grandpa, all of us. Nobody left behind." Tears stung David's eyes. He reached out, pulling her onto his lap. "That's the most beautiful bridge I've ever seen." Later, after Lily had been tucked into the guest room with her sketchbook on the nightstand, Rachel and David lingered by the fire. Thomas sat nearby, staring into the flames as though they held his past. Finally, he spoke. "I left because I was afraid. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of being like my own father, who walked out on me. But in running from that, I became him." David's fists clenched on his knees. He wanted to lash out, to hurl decades of pain back at the man who had caused it. But Lily's words, "nobody left behind," echoed louder. He drew in a long breath. "I hated you for years. I built everything I am on the promise that I'd never need you. But now I look at her, and I know if I keep carrying that hate, it will spill onto her too. And she doesn't deserve that." Thomas's eyes glistened. "I can't undo what I did. All I can do is stay now, if you'll let me." David turned to Rachel. Her eyes softened, her hand reaching for his. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "forgiveness isn't about them. It's about us. About choosing peace over the weight of what's gone." David looked back at Thomas. His voice shook, but it was steady enough. "Stay. But if you ever leave her, you'll answer to me." Thomas nodded, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "I won't leave again." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, David stood alone on the terrace. The city shimmered endlessly, but his gaze turned upward. Stars pricked the night sky, faint against the Manhattan glow. He thought of his mother, of the boy he had been, of the man who had left, and he thought of the bridge Lily had drawn. Simple, childlike, yet profound. For the first time, David felt the anger drain out of him, replaced by something lighter. Not forgetfulness, but forgiveness. Not wealth, but love. He whispered into the cold air, as though his words might climb the invisible bridge. "I'll be different. I'll stay." The next morning, Lily bounded into the kitchen waving her sketchbook. She had drawn a new picture overnight, the same bridge, but now the stars above were connected by lines, forming constellations. "Look, Daddy," she exclaimed. "It's not just a bridge. It's a family tree that reaches the sky." David lifted her into his arms, kissing her curls. "Yes, sweetheart, and we'll walk it together." Rachel smiled softly, watching them. Thomas, standing quietly in the doorway, bowed his head in silent gratitude. The penthouse, once a fortress of solitude, now pulsed with something far rarer than wealth. It pulsed with presence. And as Thanksgiving sunlight spilled across the city, the Miller family, 3 generations bound by hurt, healing, and hope, began to walk their bridge to the stars. Sometimes the greatest legacy isn't money or power, but simply the choice to stay, to be present, to love, and to forgive. Thank you for walking with us through this healing journey of David, Rachel, Lily, and their family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, so you'll never miss another story of hope, love, and second chances.